Okay, let's get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Matthew Nall. I'm an assistant professor at Miyagi University in Japan. And my co-presenter is Dr. Rod Case. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Rod Case. I'm an associate professor of TESOL at the University of Nevada in Reno, and I live in the United States.
Great, thank you. And our talk today is, did you say pragmatics, advancing instructional design to address negative transfer?
Let's get started with talking about what's happening now in the instruction of pragmatics. Up until recently, there's been a huge emphasis on the comparison of intermediate learners in research on the instruction of pragmatics. Most of the research has explored the idea of looking at what's more effective, explicit or implicit instruction. Explicit has been largely the winner in these instructions, showing to have the greatest effect on improving pragmatic competence for students. But there's been very little discussion of how to teach beginners or advanced students who would like to improve their pragmatic skills. Pragmatic competence is the most common measure or common construct that's used to understand or to measure gain in pragmatic skill. But there's been, however, there's been very little measurement of the closely related research on negative transfer. Negative transfer has to do with when there's a difference between the first language and the second language in some sort of pragmatic form or grammatical form. And instead of the learner relying on the form used in the second language, the learner relies on the form used in the first language, transfers that form from the first language and incorrectly uses it in the second language. This has, of course, the effect of slowing down second language acquisition.
Okay, thank you. Of course, as Dr. K said, pragmatic competence is used as a measure of growth. It's kind of opposed to linguistic competence, or it's a different kind of measure of growth. Pragmatic competence refers to one's knowledge of linguistics, norms of usage, and social conventions, and one's ability to use these knowledge bases in socially bound interaction. So that socially bound interaction is really important. It's pragmatics is basically the study about how context contributes to meaning, and it goes beyond the literal linguistic meaning of the words. As Dr. Case mentioned, there's been a lot of research on students at the intermediate level, but beginning and advanced learners have not been the subject of so much research out there. And there's been a lot of research done regarding the efficacy of explicit or implicit instruction, but there are not a lot of concrete teaching ideas out there for the practitioner. And that's one of our goals today, is to give you some ideas that you can take home and use in your classes. Here's today's menu. So we'll do a few things for you today. First, we'll talk a little bit about explicit and implicit instruction, and we'll describe several activities that you can use in your classes. And we'll talk about negative transfer and research on negative transfer and how that can inform your lesson plans, your instruction for students at different levels. Okay, so first, very quickly, Dr. Case already brought this up, I think, but explicit instruction is what you think it is. It's lectures and discussion about specific target forms, and it provides direct instruction on the pragmatic form. Usually incorporates some kind of metapragmatic instruction. Metapragmatic instruction is when the teachers and the students engage in some kind of discussion about a pragmatic expression. And thirdly, it provides opportunity for controlled and focused practice of forms. This is very important, of course, giving your students lots of opportunities to practice new things. Implicit, of course, lacks the lecture or discussion aspect of instruction, and it's basically about exposing your students to lots of examples of target forms, and letting them kind of figure out the rules of usage through lots of exposure. And in the research, basically, explicit instruction seems to be the most effective form of instruction.
Now on to some ideas about how you might apply this. One of the things that works very well that's used in research on negative transfer is the idea of a discourse completion task. And Matt and I used this in a study of ours and got a sense of what kinds of errors students are making at beginning levels or at advanced levels. This is what's, of course, missing in the current research on the instruction of pragmatics. There's a couple of good reasons that we used it. And while it measured negative transfer, what we found out is that a lot of times the scenarios themselves on a discourse completion task are related to work life. So it was very relevant to college-age students. And also there were controls for status-related variables. So in other words, it would have situations in which the participant is asked to make a refusal to the boss, or make a refusal to a friend, or make a refusal to somebody who's in a subordinate position. So this allowed for kind of control of these kinds of situations and limits it, which also makes it, of course, very appropriate for beginners. In the study that we did, we found out that beginners and intermediates could distinguish and discuss the use of direct refusals as well as indirect refusals. Direct refusals are, of course, things like, no, I'm not going to do that. An indirect refusal might be an example. An example of an indirect refusal might be something like giving an excuse or just saying, I'm sorry, or maybe another time. But beginners and intermediates could distinguish these and discuss these. And what we found is that they needed to stay grounded in the use of direct versus indirect refusals. In other words, they needed to be able to kind of distinguish those and write those out. Advanced students could do something very different. Now, intermediates, however, I want to go back to them, would benefit from a deeper discussion on the connection between refusal and content. And like, for instance, trying to understand the implicature of something, the implication in a particular refusal. Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, sure. Okay. Speaking of opening up opportunities to see language in use. One of the methods that can be useful is student as researcher. So in this kind of classroom activity, the students are actually performing kind of like a researcher. They're gathering data by themselves, discussing it, analyzing it, data in the form of conversation. And we'll be using, or we used social media. So online videos are a great way to use pragmatic or introduce pragmatic expressions in your classroom, and to generate some class discussion. We use two different videos, and they're from TV sitcoms. The first one is from Friends, the late 90s, early 2000s comedy sitcom about 5 friends living in New York. And all of the friends are kind of at an equal status. And then the second video was from a hospital drama called Grey's Anatomy. And in the hospital, there is a hierarchy, of course, and there are different doctors at different levels of status. And by using videos, we can draw students' attention to identity, age, gender, and status, for example, and the differences in pragmatic use of language. And it focuses on the relationship between language use and social variables. This is pragmatic instruction, right? Language use and social variables, not just on the use of grammar, not just focus on linguistic accuracy, okay? And the right side, sorry, it's very small to see there, but there's just a kind of a description of both of the videos we use from Friends and Grey's Anatomy. And the situation is a refusal of a request in both cases. In Friends, the speakers are at the same level of status, and in Grey's Anatomy, they're in a social hierarchy. Dr. Case, do you have anything to add there?
No, we're going to talk about this a little later, but it's important that you find videos that have, especially at the beginning, that have pretty clear differentials or pretty clear parameters, whether they're equal status or their status differences. That'll make it very clear for the students.
Okay, thank you.
This is slide 8. And so what we found with using this and what we've learned about it is that beginners are just learning to use refusals. And this is important. This means that they can just stick to very short sentences in very kind of clearly defined situations. The easiest ones to use are direct refusals because they don't require a lot of implicature. Intermediates can find the differences between direct and indirect refusals, identify which one's direct or which one's indirect. This was done by Morcus. And we can make students aware of these differences and why they're important as well. Indirect refusals are usually used, right, for somebody of a little higher status, whereas direct refusals are used for friends or for somebody who's a little lower status. Advanced students, they can discuss these and how they might vary, and they can even vary the parameters, write different kinds of refusals or use refusals in different situations, equal status, lower and upper status, upper and lower status, and vary the role and write their own refusals. In this particular situation, of course, it's from Friends. And Rachel and Ross were previously boyfriend and girlfriend, and they'd broken up. Jill is the sister of Rachel, and she's trying to seduce Ross in this one particular scene, but Ross doesn't know it. He thinks that Jill likes him because he's so smart. Ross is an archaeologist who studies dinosaurs. He's kind of an enigmatic, funny guy. And anyway, Jill's at his apartment and she's trying to seduce him. Rachel calls Ross in an attempt to tell him to stop seeing Jill, kick her out of the apartment. And Ross, who's full of, all kinds of kind of glib hubris because he has captured the attention of this very pretty girl named Rachel, refuses to do so. So Rachel says, Ross, I'm telling you, she's using you to get back at me. And Ross says, I can take care of myself, and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye. I think I can take care of myself acts as an indirect refusal in this situation, telling Rachel over the phone that, gee, you know what? I'm not going to do what she says. What you've asked me to do. So this is an indirect refusal. Jill tries to seduce Ross, kisses him, and then Ross pushes her away. He's very surprised at this whole thing. And so this situation is terrific for advanced learners because they can talk about the very kind of nuanced use of this indirect refusal. For intermediates, they can talk about how they might make a direct refusal and what kind of refusal Ross gives. And beginners, this would be a tough one for them, but you could rewrite it and just make an indirect or just make a direct refusal. A fun thing to do, of course, is to act the scene out or act out a similar scene. Students really like this, especially if it can be recorded on a phone or something like that. They get a big kick out of it. So this is an example of how to use just a really simple situation comedy that students will enjoy. The acting's terrific and it's very funny, and students tend to like this quite a bit. Go ahead, Matt.
Thanks. Okay, for Grey's Anatomy, basically the same thing as the Friends example, but you can scaffold the content of your lesson for beginners, intermediate, and advanced, as Dr. Casey introduced. And the Grey's Anatomy scene, if I can just introduce it quickly, there was a patient who was a victim of sexual assault. And she's in the hospital. She's very vulnerable, and the hospital staff are trying to limit her contact with male doctors. And Dr. Dulce is kind of guarding the door, and Dr. Weber tries to go in to see the patient. Dr. Weber is a male, and Dr. Dulce says very directly, "You can't go in there." Okay, let's move on.
Let's go back. I want to add a couple things on that, Matt.
Sure.
The thing that's interesting about this is that the younger doctor, Dr. Dulce, refuses the chief of medicine. Dr. Weber is at a much higher level of status than Dr. Dulce. So this is a big violation. So this becomes a terrific opportunity to talk about this violation and why he's made this violation. And the reason, of course, is because there's somebody in there who's very vulnerable, and she does not want to see a male in that room. And so this becomes a great cultural discussion. And the language in it, the language use in it is so simple that beginners can understand it. And you may have to have a discussion in the first language for beginners, but there's a lot of cultural information going on there that could be very interesting. The intermediate and advanced, of course, could make a different kind of refusal, an indirect refusal, one that's more complex, and then talk about whether they would do that or not, because Dr. Weber, of course, has a much higher status than Dr. Dulce. So I just wanted to kind of add that in.
Sure, thank you. Okay, slide 10.
I'm on to slide 10. So metapragmatic instruction, as Matt indicated earlier, is a technique in which the teacher gives explicit instruction on a particular kind of speech act. So this could be, in our case, a refusal, but it could be giving directions. It could be giving an apology, any number of different ones. And how that varies, how that speech act varies according to status level, distance, and dominance, right? So we've been talking, for instance, about giving refusals to people at different levels of status. Like to somebody who's at a lower status, you would probably give an indirect or direct refusal or equal status. But for an indirect refusal, lots of times we'll give that to somebody at a higher level of status. And metapragmatic instruction is really powerful because it shows strong results, strong gains when it's used with students at different levels. And Taguchi in 2015 did a massive review of all the research into the instruction of pragmatics and found that learners who are taught directly or given a chance to deduce pragmatic rules are at an advantage when compared to those who are only exposed to the rules. So that first discussion is very powerful. The second thing that usually happens is focused instruction. And this includes activities like in translation, enclosed role play, open-ended tasks, and also just writing out the language itself. And this is best used when it follows, like I said, metapragmatic instruction. And another review of the research by Lee showed that teachers can see results from this in just about 5 hours of instruction. So it's pretty powerful when students get a chance to talk about it, think about the rules, and then write it out. They'll get it very quickly, okay? So it can begin by asking learners to write out the dialogue and interpret what they might mean literally and without any reference to the context, and then begin kind of pulling it apart. And we've seen this scene here, and this is again from Friends. And so in this situation, the students can write this out. And then when they get to the indirect refusal, I think I can take care of myself. If you look at that literally, that means I'm a big boy and I'm able to feed myself and go to the doctor and, you know, brush my teeth. So it doesn't make any sense if you talk about it literally. Why would he say that to Rachel when she's trying to kind of suggest that he needs to quit? Well, he's saying that because it's not the explicit meaning that we're looking at. It's the implicit meaning, which of course means I'm not going to listen to you. I'm smart enough, and I don't need to listen to you about this. I know what Jill's trying to do, and she's not trying to seduce me. And so this is the idea behind metapragmatic instruction: to look at it, what it means literally, and then to think about what it might mean implicitly. And if you focus on those indirect refusals or indirect speech acts of this, you know, more broadly, then you can really engage the students in the language and get them to really think carefully about it. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Oops, going a little further with, again, with metapragmatic instruction in beginners. In an EFL context where students share the same L1, it can be very beneficial to discuss the context or to discuss the conversation in the student's L1. In an ESL context, it's a little more complicated because students usually don't share the L1. With instruction of beginners, for example, you can center on noticing the relationships between indirect refusals and dominance, and you can focus the student's attention on, especially on levels of status by highlighting, for example, in Friends, they're speaking on a first name basis, right? Whereas in Grey's Anatomy, they're using titles. So you can draw the students' attention towards that. Dr. Case, do you have anything to add to this one?
No, I think that's good. And the titles thing is very important. It also has kind of a cultural element. And the first name basis has a cultural element, and those are discussions that can happen with advanced students too. Why do we use these? How do they differ from our own culture?
Okay. Number 13. We got about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Oh, okay. And so this is for advanced and intermediate students, and it's a good idea to ask them to try and create their own kind of scenarios or contrasting scenarios. We could imagine the situation if Rachel and Ross were not friends and maybe they just met each other, or Rachel was Ross's boss, or different kinds of things. And that can be a really powerful experience for students to explore too. Go ahead.
Okay, 14.
And then for intermediates, they are going to struggle with the implications. That means they're going to struggle with, how can I think I can take care of myself? How can that represent a refusal? And so that's going to require some pretty heavy lifting during metapragmatic instruction. You're going to have to really talk to them about how these differences take place. And like I said earlier, advanced learners can ask how the meaning of the dialogue might change. They can actually vary it. They can use different or create different kinds of indirect refusals as a way of kind of revising the whole scenario itself. They'll have the proficiency to do this. Okay. And then focus practice, of course, can be quite short. They can compose and act out dialogues, write them out. Beginners, of course, or intermediates can work on direct and indirect refusals and how they vary. And then for beginners, it's titles and names and trying to understand sort of socially what's going on, or pragmatically what's going on. And you can look at the different situations: teacher and student, employer, employee. And the dialogues will be short, especially with beginners, but with some encouragement on the use of paralinguistic clues, like, in other words, gestures, such as facial expression, tone of voice, and gesture. They can be actually quite successful with doing this kind of thing. Okay. And I want to thank everybody for being here. Yep. And I hope you enjoyed. Again, my name is Rod Case. I'm an associate professor, and I'm from the University of Nevada in Reno and in the United States.
Yeah, thank you again as well. Again, my name is Matthew Nall, assistant professor at Miyagi University in Japan. So thank you for coming, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.